Buenos días y bienvenidos a la quinta mesa de las VIII Jornadas sobre Teoría Crítica, organizadas por el Grupo de Investigación de Teoría Crítica de la Universidad Católica. La edición de este año lleva como título Innovaciones democráticas y transformaciones económicas, enfoques pluralistas. El día de hoy contaremos con dos ponencias a cargo de los profesores Rúrion Melo y Kuch. Good morning and welcome to the 8th edition of our Critical Theory Conference. This year they are called Democratic Innovations and Economic Transformations, Pluralist Approaches. Today we will have two conferences in charge of Professor Rurion Melo and Professor Kuch. So, about the dynamic of the event, each panel will last 120 minutes and each speaker will have 30 to 35 minutes for their presentation. After both presentations, the commentator will have 10 minutes to ask questions for both speakers, after which each speaker will have 10 minutes to respond. In the remaining time, questions from the public and other participants will be answered. About questions from the public, they can be sent and formulated by the Zoom chat, and I will read them to the speakers at the end of the panel. Sobre la dinámica de la mesa, cada panel tendrá una duración de 120 minutos, donde cada ponente tendrá entre 30 y 35 minutos para realizar su presentación. Después de ambas presentaciones, la persona encargada de los comentarios tendrá 10 minutos para formular preguntas a ambos ponentes, y cada uno de ellos tendrá 10 minutos para responderlas. En el tiempo restante, las preguntas del público y otros participantes podrán ser respondidas. Estas podrán ser formuladas a través del chat de Zoom para leerlas al final de los ponentes de la mesa. So, our first speaker today will be Professor Rurion Melo. He's a professor at the Department of Political Science of the University of Sao Paulo and a researcher at the Brazilian Center for Analysis and Planning. He is one of the coordinators of the Habermas collection of the Sao Paulo State University Press. He is primarily devoted to the following topics: critical theory, Marxism, and political theory, theories of democracy, the public sphere, and struggles for recognition. His last publications are Experiences, Struggle, and Recognition, and Democracy and Forms of Life, Political Culture and Democratic Sittlichkeit in Axel-Honneth. El primer ponente de hoy día será el profesor Rurion Melo, quien es profesor doctorado e investigador del Centro Brasilero de Análisis y Planificación. Es uno de los coordinadores de la colección Habermas en la editorial de la Universidad Estatal Paulista. Se dedica principalmente a los siguientes temas: teoría crítica, marxismo y teoría política, teorías de la democracia, esfera pública y luchas por el reconocimiento. Entre sus últimas publicaciones están Experiences and Struggles and Recognition y Democracia como forma de vida, cultura política y eticidad democrática en Axel-Honneth. With nothing further to add, I'm giving the word to Professor Rurion Melio. Sin nada más que agregar, le cedo la palabra al profesor Rurion Melio.
Buenos días, todos y todas. Hi, everyone. I would like to thank Gianfranco very much for inviting me to be part of this amazing event. I want to congratulate all the organizers as well. And I must say that it's a pleasure to share this session with Hannes and Alessandra. Thank you very much. I will read my text in English, okay? And you can also follow the Spanish translation. So in recent years, one of the most important diagnoses that has been widely discussed in social theory and political theory is the crisis of democracy. In political science, in particular, the crisis of democracy is discussed mainly as a crisis of democratic institutions. In the present text, it will be impossible to summarize the discussion around the approach in political science. For this reason, considering the discussion that I intend to present here, I would like to start with two initial observations. First, the crisis of democracy has been hegemonically debated from the point of view of the state, that is, as a type of instability or malfunction in the political system, I believe that this vision is tributary of an approach that we could call the perspective of traditional theory when thinking about the crisis of democracy. It is above all an institutionalist approach, which moves between analyses that are sometimes positivist or that are guided by excessively normative criteria about how democracy should function correctly as a political regime. Second, and this is what I want to underline in this brief presentation, unlike the perspective of traditional theory, so to speak, I argue that critical theory can decisively contribute to the production of a diagnosis of the current crisis of democracy, because critical theory also investigates such a crisis without conceiving democracy as a state-centered concept. Therefore, critical theory can collaborate in the investigation of the democratic crisis in a different sense when compared to the institutionalist approach that generally understands democracy as something limited to a political regime. For critical theory, democracy is above all a form of life, and its crisis must be investigated mainly as a crisis in the democratic form of life. Therefore, I would like to bring to the fore the social dimension that makes up a democratic political culture, that is, modes of conviviality and sociability that cannot be reduced to the state, and return to one of the most important categories with which critical theory has contributed to the production of time diagnosis, the public sphere. The public sphere is better understood as a heuristic social dimension in which social and political conflicts emerge, and that understanding is fruitful for the production of time diagnosis. One of the most important aspects of a critical and social research on the public sphere is to realize that there is no unified and fully hegemonic public sphere. What exists is above all a multiplicity of publics. Publics are formed by the reflective circulation of texts, photos, videos, performances, and other discursive media. They can be more or less local or even global, more or less integrated, more or less official and institutionalized, and of course, more or less digital. In this sense, it is possible to understand the conflictual dynamics in the public sphere, considering the confrontation between publics that are dominant, in general, closer to the state, economic and cultural power, and other publics that are not dominant, that are counter-hegemonic. Recent empirical researches on the dynamics of the public sphere in Brazil helped us to interpret the crisis of democracy as a crisis of hegemony of the dominant public sphere. These approaches contribute to the production of broad diagnosis regarding the crisis of legitimation of dominant public spheres based on the conflicting dynamics of counterpublics. A crucial aspect of this crisis, which I interpret here as a crisis of democracy, is precisely the proliferation of counterpublics on the left and on the right, facilitated by the internet. These counterpublics have a complex dynamic, as we shall see. They are more or less central, more or less dominant, more or less peripheral and subordinate. And the central, dominant, peripheral, or subordinate position will decide the directions and the composition of the mentioned crisis in each case and context. From the point of view of theoretical reconstruction, this formulation of the problem refers to the post-Habermasian reception of the concept of the public sphere. As is well known, the concept of the public sphere has undergone important changes in the contemporary debate. One, once considered a critical category, over time it came to be denounced for being blind to different forms of domination, for not being inclusive and plural enough. If we briefly return to the type of criticism raised a long time ago against the concept, especially in the version presented in Habermas's classic book, Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, we will be able to understand the conceptual limits pointed out in this debate. Habermas's intention in this book, originally published in 1962, was to carry out an investigation of the historical trends of the public sphere as a bourgeois category, from the 17th to the mid-20th century in England, France, and Germany. He exposes its emergence in the liberal context with the formation of a public composed of critically debating private persons, and investigates its subsequent transformation in the framework of the welfare state. His purpose is not only to provide a historical description, but also to show the emancipatory bourgeois ideals linked to the idea of democracy as self-determination and political self-government of free and equal citizens. Furthermore, the central thesis of the book does not consist in presenting and defending these normative criteria of inclusion and citizen equality that the public sphere represents, but above all, in showing its decay in the conditions of mass democracies and the welfare state. The book was written under the paradigm of the critique of ideology, and it is precisely the very concept of the public sphere that is denounced by Habermas when it comes to contain an ideological use in the class conditions of contemporary capitalism. In any case, the author shows that since its origins, the public sphere was intended to somehow represent the normative principles of inclusion, equality, and participation that would mark the project of democratic citizenship and establish the central critical criteria of modern political legitimacy. Most of the criticisms addressed to the book underline historical assumptions that are insufficient and partial, since Habermas would have reduced the concept to the reality of the dominant bourgeois civil society. According to this restricted conception, many would end up being excluded from the reconstruction of the presented bourgeois public sphere, as Habermas himself recognizes in his 1990 preface. That would not, for example, be the history of the proletariat in the same period, and not also a public sphere sensitive to gender domination. There are important criticisms that made Habermas rethink his own model of the public sphere many years later. In this debate, Nancy Fraser's contribution is decisive. Fraser systematized the limits of the classical, liberal, or official concept of the public sphere, mainly because it is incapable of encompassing a more current diagnosis of new social movements and political struggles in multicultural societies. The concept of public sphere, according to Fraser, leaves out precisely the alternative forms of public expression, the counter-publics, or more precisely, the subaltern counter-publics, aimed at combating the dominant mode of the public sphere. Fraser states that subaltern groups form, I quote, parallel discursive arenas where members of subordinate social groups invent and circulate counter-discourses, which in turn permit them formulate oppositional interpretations of their identities, interests, and needs, end of quote. And such members of subordinate social groups are made up of women, workers, people of color, gays, and lesbians. Therefore, the alternative concept of subaltern counterpublic developed by Fraser opened new possibilities for the use of the category of public sphere in investigations on the political and social struggles of subordinate groups, represented, according to the author, mainly by issues of feminism, of racism, and sexuality. However, the concept of counterpublic also came to be used in a variety of ways, thus contributing to investigations and research on new political and social conflicts. There's Donnie and Fanto researches, but also Michael Warner's texts and investigations. For the context of our discussion, it's important to emphasize that the relationship with recent political diagnosis means that the concept of counterpublic came to be used both for disputes between groups that were considered progressive and for conservative groups, currently often called by the general name of New Right, who also understand themselves as counterpublic in a given context. This possibility of encompassing groups with different ideological and thematic spectrum definitively marks the reception of the idea of counterpublicity in Brazil. If theories of the public sphere were if theories of the public sphere were already commonly used in local studies of sociology, history, and political science, the concept of counterpublic helped to enrich the diagnosis of social and political processes in the Brazilian context. The concept allowed us to outline power disputes and emancipatory struggles in the formation of our Brazilian public sphere. From abolitionist discourses through thematization of subaltern public sectors, Blacks, women, indigenous people, peasants, urban workers, through the formation of our civil society and through more porous forms of institutionalized participation, as well as collectively self-organized modes of political constitution, direct actions, and forms of civil disobedience, with new configurations of feminism and anti-racist struggles, student movements, and groups with conservative agendas. Subaltern counterpublics and right-wing publics refer to different demands, perspectives, ideologies, and interests, but both play a decisive role in the elaboration of a critical theory of politics linked to social research. It is undeniable that we have to identify important differences between publics that are formed around progressive social issues and others concerned rather with more neoliberal views on economics or conservative views on customs, or between the social subalternity of some groups and the self-perceived subordination of others. That said, the use of the concept of counterpublic to describe non-progressive positions does not diminish its empirical descriptive potential. The concept can and should be modified for its proper use in social research. According to the historical investigation carried out by Fernando Perlato, since the 19th century, we have had to live with two different and simultaneous types of public sphere. The first of these is called the selective public sphere, because only a few actors from the cultural, economic, and political elites were able to participate and publicly debate their topics of interest. However, at the same time, we also had here the formation of subaltern public spheres formed by different spaces of sociability in which the subaltern segments sought to organize themselves. From abolitionist and anti-racist discourses through popular struggles of subaltern sectors that were able to organize themselves into political parties, from the organization of peasant leagues to new social movements that entered the scene in civil society, all of them historically constituted subaltern public spheres in Brazil that attempted to resist hegemonic discourses in different ways, thus disputing worldviews formulated in the official and dominant public sphere. Confrontation and opposition depend on the mode of participation and expression of subaltern groups, which are not determined by traditional institutional criteria. Subaltern participation occurs through new, skillful performances of resistance and manifestation. Only in this way, I quote Perlato, the popular sectors in Brazil were able to resist the hegemonic imposition built in the selective public sphere, managing to establish at certain times subaltern public spheres that, despite not being able to raise their demands to the elitist public sphere, and therefore disputing the hegemony of society, were able to build other discourses anchored in a popular culture full of innovative strength, creativity, and potential. The contexts in which the concept of subaltern counterpublics were used date back to different historical moments. Perlato recognized the importance of Eder Sader's approach, a reference in the studies of popular movements and public sphere in Brazil. Sader would have shown how the re-democratization period after dictatorship was decisively marked by the emergence of new actors who sought to pressure the selected public sphere to make their voices heard and press for the pursuit of their interests. For Sader's methodological starting point, consisted in examining the link between new social movements, those occurring from the second half of the 1970s in Brazil, and the everyday life of the popular classes. As he himself states, the objective of his research was defined according to the ways in which social movements opened new political spaces, reworking themes from everyday experience. Sader then sought to investigate how experiences in alternative public spheres began to open up new political spaces in order to allow people to re-elaborate different themes of everyday experience that, most of the time, given the authoritarianism of the dictatorial government, are not expressed in traditional institutions. Sader starts from the ambiguous of a negative and transformative impact of urbanization in people's daily lives, the lack of political freedom imposed by the military dictatorship, investigates the creation of new intermediary public spaces, and analyzes the organized political configuration resulting from the experiences and ways of life consolidated in that period. This, accompanied by daily experiences, both negative and self-organizing, and motivated by a deep distrust in the institutions of an authoritarian political system, the popular classes end up sedimenting a subordinate and self-organized political culture, which values a deep appreciation of autonomy. I quote Sader again, "The repudiation of the established form of political practice, seen as manipulation, had its counterpart, the desire to be subjects of their own history, taking in their hands the decisions that affected their conditions of existence. With that, they ended up broadening the very notion of politics as they politicized multiple spheres of their daily lives." In this sense, his approach is quite particular for underlying at that moment that the struggles for justice referred to different histories and experiences and to the movements concerned with their own autonomy. Well, it's no coincidence then that the groups considered subaltern in Brazil were constituted by the mentioned literature around quite progressive demands linked to greater political participation, the expansion of grammars for justice, social and human rights, and recognition of difference. However, the concept of counterpublics has been used in new social research, not only linked to progressive demands. And to understand this use, it is necessary to see that the current characterization of counterpublics in Brazil depends on the relationship with broader diagnoses and events, especially with a new moment of hegemony crisis in the Brazilian public sphere. In order to complement the studies mentioned so far, my central hypothesis is that the current uses of the concept in Brazil depend to a great extent on certain social and political contexts that can be divided into two main moments. First, the period characterized for the formation of Lulism, and for a broad project of society based on the notion of social developmentalism, social desenvolvimentismo. And second, the subsequent period characterized this time by the crisis of Lulism and the corresponding crisis of the social developmentalist project of society. Even the social gains achieved in the period, which were the result of policy of income redistribution combined with economic growth, did not prevent indignation and revolts against the government. There was dissatisfaction with the quality of public services, precarious employment, low racial and gender inclusion, urban violence, among other factors. Much of this dissatisfaction came to light in the June revolts 2013. The underlying diagnosis, which has been presupposed to explain the hypothesis of the actual emergence and constitution of counterpublics in Brazil, is centered on the more general idea that the new counterpublics were paradoxically formed as a reaction and opposition to the political and cultural hegemony represented by governments considered progressive and for the achievements of society in this period. In this sense, both groups with more progressive and more radically democratic agendas were counter-hegemonic to Lulism and the social developmentalist project, as well as groups configured around the liberal conservative aliens, that is, groups that remained dissatisfied with the achievements and proposals of the current governments. In other words, either because they fall short of a radically democratic project, as in the case of criticism from progressive groups, or because they carry out a broad project of society considered a left-wing project, in which redistributive policies are joined together with agendas including recognition of differences, as in the case of liberal conservative groups. Such groups formed themselves as counter-publics and sought to expand through confrontation and opposition their underrepresentation in the public sphere. The formation of these counter-publics become crucial for the critical diagnosis that involves the process of political disputes, which implies understanding their characteristics, political strategies, their diverse interests, and also political cultures that support them between left-wing and right-wing groups with progressive or conservative ideologies, with their class, race, gender characteristics, etc., and with its ambiguities and intersectionalities. They can be counter-publics formed by new feminist collectives, by high school students who, between 2015 and 2016, executed a series of acts of civil disobedience and occupied hundreds of public schools throughout Brazil, or by a liberal conservative militancy of the Brazilian New Right. It's worth highlighting the specificity with which such counter-publics are constituted considering the centrality of the internet. Disputes between different virtual groups, reactions channeled in digital media, and the consolidation of oppositional discourses generated confrontations around various public controversies. These themes allows us to visualize a multifaceted use of the concept of counterpublics that, to a great extent, dialogues both with Fraser's initial formulation and also with approaches like that of Michael Warner. Even reflections on structural transformations of certain counterpublics have already been developed in the Brazilian context. For example, Jonas Medeiros is dedicated to understand the specificity of the new forms of counterpublics constituted by Black feminists, by showing the structural changes that occurred in the transition from popular feminism to peripheral feminism, considering above all collectives with artistic cultural practices. The most current configuration of these feminist counterpublics is constituted by their less institutionalized practices, by the way in which digital counterpublics and mass self-communication replaced some articulated networks of feminist NGOs, by the formation of collectives that were not organized in political parties, and by the religious pluralization that changed the way in which counterpublics were rooted in the daily life of urban peripheries. In this way, the mentioned crisis of Lulism and of the social developmentalist model of society generated a political process that included both subordinate counterpublics with agendas considered progressive, although they were not hegemonic publics from the point of view of their institutionalization. I mean, counterpublics that remained on the margins of conquest's institutionalized social movements, especially within the scope of feminist and anti-racist movements that were already organized around the state, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a right-wing counter-publicity that was directly against a more progressive political culture and against certain achievements in terms of social welfare. A public that is defending a radically liberal economy and a conservative vision, which was based on traditional values of religion and family. This last form of right-wing counter-publicity takes us to the heart of the Bolsonarismo. As Medeiros, Rocha, and Solano state, the hegemony of the bourgeois public sphere that took place during the period of the military dictatorship revealed the intersectional character of the term bourgeois in Brazil. Instead of being limited to the class dictatorship and to the persecution of workers and communists, our bourgeois autocracy also proved to be white, male, and heterosexual. And they continue, I quote, recognizing that arrangement is fundamental to understand both Brazil's process of democratization and the emergence of Bolsonarism in 21st century. Ultimately, it was the actions of workers, women, and Black, indigenous, and LGBT plus Brazilians, among other groups, that blocked the bourgeois autocracy and the cultural industry from controlling the country's pre-democratization in the 1970s and 80s from the top down. Though they did not have strong decision-making power in the traditional public sphere debate, beginning in their own alternative press allowed for the development of diverse public opinion that began to penetrate the state, especially through the slow work of social movements. When the dictatorship ended in 1985, the constitutional drafting process that soon followed between 87 and 88 ended up including many of these movements' demands. Now, if on the one hand, this process of inclusion of alternative publics lead to new forms of institutionalization that became effective in the 1988 Constitution, which is considered a progressive and democratic constitution. On the other hand, from the perspective of the right-wing publics, this process institutionalized a model of society against which liberals and conservatives should fight. In the perception of these groups, the post-bourgeois public sphere, to use an expression by Fraser, represented a crisis of hegemony of the dominant bourgeois public sphere and meant the rise of the power of the left. Thus, with the slogan, less Marx, more Mises, the new right formed over many years a counter-public whose purpose was to fight everything that was achieved from the political and social point of view in the period of post-bourgeois public sphere. However, now the right-wing counter-publicity has not restored the bourgeois hegemony that was lost after democratization, as it produced a different form of public dispute and opposition. The genesis of Bolsonarism can be identified in this process of loss of hegemony of dominant publics, in the confrontation between different counter-publics in the public sphere. Bolsonarism is therefore an expression of a broad democratic crisis that can be perceived when we look at the dynamics of conflicts in the public sphere. So, to finish, counterpublics have proven to be decisive for the prediction of diagnoses about the current conflicts between dominant publics and excluded social groups, workers, Black people, women, among others, and the formation of an alternative associative life, sites and forums for members of subaltern groups where they can discuss and formulate their own perspectives in an autonomous way. But counter-public actions also created new conservative reactions. Therefore, we have to understand the nature of these conflicts in the public sphere according to the ideas, arguments, campaigns, forms of protests, votes, and investigate how they are influencing broader public debates and confrontations. We are witnessing the coming to power of right-wing populist parties, which makes explicit conservative elements of political cultures, and not only in Brazil. This process is leading to legal and institutional changes and laying down the central features of a widespread crisis of democracy. Political and social theories need to consider that this composition of the public sphere has provoked increasingly intense public disputes, sometimes violent disputes, between progressive and conservative groups, which permeate both institutional arrangements and everyday social relations. Therefore, it is the task of a critical theory of democracy to produce a comprehensive and situated diagnosis of the conflicts that mark our political culture today. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias al profesor Rúrion Melo por su exposición. Thank you so much for your presentation. Ahora pasaré a presentar al segundo ponente del día de hoy, que es el profesor Hannes Kuch. I will now proceed to introduce our second speaker today, who is Professor Hannes Kuch. He is a postdoc at the Department of Philosophy at the Goethe-Universität of Frankfurt. He leads a research project on social freedom and market socialism. In the research project, he explores the normative foundations and institutional requirements of a liberal socialism, drawing on the tradition of Hegel, Marx, and the Frankfurt School. His research interests cover the topics of recognition, intersubjectivity, economy and society, power and violence, as well as speech acts and performativity. His last publications are Justice, Ethical Dispositions, and Liberal Socialism, and Social Freedom Beyond Capitalism, Three Alternatives. Nuestro segundo ponente del día de hoy es el profesor Hannes Kuch, quien actualmente realiza un postdoctorado en el Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad de Frankfurt, donde dirige un proyecto de investigación sobre libertad social y socialismo de mercado. En su investigación explora los fundamentos normativos y los requisitos institucionales de un socialismo liberal, basándose en la tradición de Hegel, Marx y la Escuela de Frankfurt. Sus intereses de investigación abarcan los temas de reconocimiento e intersubjetividad, economía y sociedad, poder y violencia, así como actos de habla y performatividad. Entre sus últimas publicaciones se encuentran Justice, Ethical Disposition and Liberal Socialism y Social Freedom Beyond Capitalism, Three Alternatives. Sin nada más que agregar, le cedo la palabra al profesor Kuch. With nothing further to add, now I'm giving the word to Professor Hannes Kuch. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks a lot for the invitation. It's really great to participate in this conference. It's a great event. I'm really proud to be part of it. Okay, so my talk is about capitalism, critique, and utopia. So I'm going to talk about critical theory's relation to alternatives to capitalism. In critical theory, there are, roughly speaking, three different approaches to alternatives to capitalism. So one approach holds that there are no alternatives to capitalism and that we can only try to tame that system from the outside. And I think Jürgen Habermas is, of course, the most vocal proponent of that approach. Another approach claims that surely there are alternatives to capitalism, but that it would be wrong to draw plans and blueprints of that alternative. And I think this is the dominant approach in critical theory, ranging from Marx, beginning with Marx, over Adorno, to Rahel Jägi more recently. Now, in recent years, a third strand tentatively emerged, and this strand distances itself from the utopian reticence, the utopophobia, as David Leopold says, of the second strand, by maintaining that there are alternatives to capitalism, but that critical theorists must say more about what these alternatives could look like. So the claim is that occasional vague hints do not suffice. And I think Nancy Fraser's and Axel Honnett's recent work points in this direction. Okay. In my talk today, I will not argue directly against the first approach. I will simply assume that there are a whole range of reasons to criticize capitalism, just as there are good reasons to doubt the hope in taming capitalism externally. What I'm interested in is the question of utopias. So assuming that there is at least some hope for an alternative to capitalism, or to put it even more cautiously, that we cannot completely rule out that there are such alternatives. My question is if critical theorists should make explicit what these alternatives could look like. And my claim is that this is in fact the case. So we as critical theorists, we should spell out in some detail what an alternative to capitalism could look like. So the aim of the talk is obviously to expand on the third approach and to defend it against objections. Okay, before I start, some conceptual clarifications. By utopia, I do not mean unrealizable dream worlds, but Eric Olin Wright's real utopias or John Rawls's realistic utopia. These kinds of utopia are typically based on heterodox practices or practical experiments. They outline a just or good social order that is radically different to our current one, but a social order that is still within the limits of human nature on the one hand, and of the constraints of social life on the other hand. By capitalism, I mean an economic system characterized first by a private property in the means of production, second, class inequalities between the owners of the means of production and workers, third, a dynamic of capital accumulation and profit maximization, and fourth, the dependence of most members of society on a labor market income. Finally, by alternative to capitalism, I mean any economic system that structurally overcomes at least some of these features that I just mentioned, as opposed to taming capitalism through external regulation or redistribution. Okay, my talk has 3 sections. In the first 2 sections, I present 2 arguments for developing alternatives to capitalism. And after that, I'm going to proceed to refute 1 important objection to my approach. That will be the topic of the third part. Okay, first part, negativistic powerlessness. So the first reason for envisioning alternatives to capitalism is the increasing powerlessness of the method of determinate negation given the historical situation that we face. So this claim is, of course, directed against the long-standing assumption in critical theory that the method of determinate negation suffices for the purposes of overcoming capitalism. Following Hegel, the idea of determinate negation is that the critique of the existing social order is not simply destructive, but productive. It may yield the rough shape or the broad outlines of a better society, even without spelling out positively what that society will look like. So as Adorno put it, quote, consummate negativity, once squarely faced, delineates the mirror image of its opposite, end of quote. So the claim is that by getting right what the problem with capitalism is, we gain a new and indirect knowledge. We expand our knowledge of what the alternative to capitalism should not look like. And the more refined this process of negation gets, the more we can narrow down how a non-capitalist society should look like. And the better, the sharper our focus on it becomes. So certainly the method of determinate negation is important, and it once might have been sufficient for critical theory, but my claim is that this is no longer true. The historical trajectory of capitalism and the failure of its alternatives to this date have deeply shattered the hope in any alternative to it. Today it seems easier, as Mark Fisher put it, quote, to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, end of quote. So yes, it's true, after the world financial crisis, social movements against capitalism gained traction, but these movements are still far away from the social power of the old workers' movement of the bygone centuries. And yes, it's also true that the activist slogan, "Another world is possible," found its voice in the public sphere, but tangible proposals are missing, or they remain vague. Yeah, a major reason for the loss of faith in alternatives to capitalism is without doubt the historical turning point of 1989. The collapse of actually existing socialism in the Eastern Bloc led to the proclamation of the end of history. That is the claim that the democratic constitutional state, as well as the capitalist market economy, mark the final and unsurmountable stage of human history. Actually existing socialism and its demise seems to have taught us that alternatives to capitalism are simply not viable. The suspicion is that alternatives to capitalism will lead to huge inefficiencies, to dramatic losses of material well-being. So I do not want to fully endorse that picture, but I do think it would be reckless, no, it would be complacent, not reckless, complacent, to consider it entirely wrong from the outset. In some sense, then, 1989 brought all alternatives to capitalism under the suspicion of being nothing but mere utopias, pipe dreams that are doomed to fail. Now, there is even another problem. The loss of faith in alternatives to capitalism not only bears on questions of viability or feasibility, more fundamentally still, it also bears on the level of desirability. So here, the suspicion is that counter-projects to capitalism are not even desirable because they're not simply unrealistic fantasies, they are real dangers. So the suspicion is. So in that perspective, utopian projects seem to be prone to turn into totalitarian repression. And that seems to be, of course, the obvious lesson of the numerous socialist dictatorships of the past century, from Stalin to Mao to Pol Pot. And I should mention that this is not just a concern of liberal or centrist thinkers, but this is also a concern of thinkers in the Marxist and leftist tradition. For example, Agnes Heller recently voiced particularly that concern. Again, I do not mean to suggest that this narrative is plainly true, but it certainly reflects a widespread belief. And I do think it would be reckless, this time reckless, to simply take the easy way out and claim that Marx's idea of communism had nothing to do at all with the crimes perpetrated in its name. So the problem seems to be twofold. Alternatives to capitalism now either seem unfeasible or they seem entirely undesirable. And given critical theory's commitment to historical situatedness, I think it is crucial to take this historical constellation into account. Because I think once the belief prevails that all forms of utopia either amount to unrealistic fantasies or to totalitarian dystopias, the method of determinate negation drastically loses its power. Since 1989, the response to the numerous criticisms of capitalism quite often is that capitalism surely is the worst of all economic systems, except for all other systems we know. And that's, of course, an allusion to one of Churchill's phrases. So the response often is, of course, capitalism is bad, but the alternatives are even worse. And I think it is this seemingly disillusioned realism that turned the tides massively to the disadvantage of purely negative forms of critique. And in this constellation, I think negating capitalism might not achieve much more than contributing to the prevailing hopelessness and cynicism. Okay, so what we need then are tangible counterproposals, concrete models that are capable of demonstrating that alternatives to capitalism are possible. Working out feasible alternatives to capitalism can change the hegemonic beliefs that today still limit what is considered politically achievable. As Eric Olin Wright pointed out, political achievability crucially depends on the belief in the viability of social alternatives. The better our knowledge of feasible and desirable alternatives to capitalism, the stronger the force of critique. So when there is a widespread sense that alternatives to capitalism are clearly within our reach, so that we kind of just have to grab the chance, then social conditions will appear much more malleable. I will now move on to the second part with the title, The Need for theoretical clarification. So the second reason for turning our attention to real utopias is the need for theoretical self-clarification. And this reason arises from the fact that it is fundamentally unclear and also highly controversial which of the potential alternatives to capitalism should actually garner our support. The background of the argument is that on closer examination, the question of alternatives to capitalism is actually less bleak than it seems from this hegemonic perspective. Debating alternatives to capitalism came back on the agenda in recent years, even though this debate is still relegated to a theoretical niche existence to some extent, and in the public sphere it is even less visible. But there is a quite lively debate about alternatives to capitalism, ranging from commons economies to market socialism to democratic planning, to name just a few of the proposals that are discussed. So I think this is, of course, a welcome development, but there are several problems. One problem is that many of these alternatives to capitalism are often only mentioned in passing, as if they were ready-to-hand solutions, or they are referred to in a way that suggests that if problems should arise, they will be easy to solve, as if we could be certain that eventually all good things will go together. So, for example, Eva von Redeker, in her recent book, in her vision of a post-capitalist life, in her recent book, Revolution for Life, draws on the model of local commons economies that can largely do without markets or money as coordination mechanisms. And once she discusses coordination problems, and these kinds of problems, coordination problems, will almost certainly arise on a larger social scale. So when she discusses these coordination problems, she conjectures that everything will be fine because digital planning techniques will get the job done. But can we really rely on techniques of digitalization? What about the right to privacy in the face of the planning agencies and its bureaucrats sitting behind their computer screens? Von Redeker is confident that these digital techniques can work in anonymized form, but she's not going into detail about how to ensure that. And I think this is really problematic. I think we have to look at the details, we have to look at the fine prints of the proposals that we put forward. Okay, so another surprising challenge comes actually from the other end of the political spectrum, not from the radical left, but from the liberal center. In recent years, it became increasingly clear that an astonishingly far-reaching proposal for an alternative to capitalism comes from none other than John Rawls. So Rawls, of all people, one is tempted to say, since Rawls is usually understood as offering nothing more than a justification of welfare capitalism, or if not, US neoliberalism. But Rawls is quite explicit that welfare capitalism is incompatible with his theory of justice, and laissez-faire capitalism, of course, even less. He argues for an economic system that he calls a property-owning democracy. And its main characteristic is a widespread and almost egalitarian dispersal of the ownership in the means of production. So a property-owning democracy doesn't simply redistribute income ex post after the fact. It restructures the prior conditions of producing wealth in the first place. And I think in doing so, one of the central aims of a property-owning democracy is, in fact, to, quote, to eliminate the conflict, that's a quote by Alan Thomas, to eliminate the conflict between capital and labor construed as distinct classes within society. So property-owning democracy obviously seems to aim at abolishing one of the most fundamental wrongs of capitalism that critical theory always criticized, namely its class injustice. Thus, it seems that Rawls has long since overtaken critical theorists in the left lane. He has simply passed us by without us really noticing. So what's the problem with a property-owning democracy? I think critical theorists cannot and should not content themselves with that economic system. We can say quite much about the deficiencies of that system, and we should approach this task as critical theorists, not in some other capacity, as if we had, two different jobs to do. One in the morning, there we are critical theorists, and the other job in the evening, there we are discussing alternatives to capitalism. I think putting alternatives to capitalism under scrutiny needs critical theorists. For critical theory, more than any other approach, is equipped with a sharp eye for power relations in social structures and for the autonomous, self-reinforcing dynamics of social institutions, the eigendynamic of social institutions and practices. Normative theories of justice in the Rawlsian tradition typically have a blind spot for this because they largely treat institutions as neutral intermediaries. So in the case of a property-owning democracy, the hypothesis could be that capitalist enterprises will survive the abolition of class inequalities. In other words, the elimination of the antagonism between a capitalist class and a working class might not necessarily result in the disappearance of the capitalist structure of the firm. I'm not going into detail here why this might be the case. I think there are several reasons why this might be the case. But if this is the case, then critical theories focus on power relations and institutional dynamics is actually much needed. For example, in terms of the accumulation dynamics originating from capitalist enterprises, or in terms of the exploitative effects of these kinds of firms for wage laborers. So this critical analysis is a negativistic endeavor, but it is actually going beyond criticizing actually existing capitalism. Instead, it is another version of a turn to alternatives to capitalism. So it corroborates my overall argument that critical theory should turn its attention to analyzing alternatives to capitalism. Okay. Now, let's come to the third and final part. Are blueprints fundamentally undemocratic? I have outlined two reasons why we should turn our attention to alternatives to capitalism. The first reason was the need for tangible alternatives in our historical situation, a situation where the hegemonic ideology largely admits the ills of capitalism, but remains pessimistic about any alternative to it. The other reason was that the proposals on table need further elaboration and they need critical analysis. So despite these reasons for envisioning real utopias, one might still object that there are also strong reasons against it, reasons perhaps even stronger than those put forward so far. So here are three important objections to developing alternatives to capitalism. So the first objection, that's a political objection. This objection argues that the search for a perfectly ideal world that looks good on paper is counterproductive and leads astray. Envisioning real utopias distracts our attention, so this objection claims, from tackling the most pressing problems that we face here and now. The second objection is an epistemic objection, and it maintains that detailed plans and blueprints presuppose a form of knowledge that is simply impossible to attain. So our knowledge of future developments seems to be far too limited. So this objection argues to allow for any meaningful claims about utopian projects. Finally, there is a normative objection, and this objection argues that even if it were possible to obtain sufficient knowledge about future possibilities, coming up with ultimate models would be undemocratic. So I think each of these objections, of course, raises serious concerns, but I think none of them is persuasive, all things considered. For reasons of time and space, I confine myself to the third objection. Only the third objection will be the topic of the last part. And I think this is also because the third objection, the normative objection, articulates the gravest concern. Okay, so the worry of the normative objection is, of the third objection is, that in drawing up detailed plans and blueprints, the theorist assumes the role of an engineer who manipulates social relations at the drawing board, just like the architect manipulates stones, walls, and rooftops. And this, of course, appears to be bluntly undemocratic. And in fact, I think this must have been one of the major reasons for Marx's distaste for detailed plans and blueprints. In coming up with these kinds of models, theorists behave as if they had, quote Marx, the solution of all riddles lying in their writing desks, and the stupid exoteric world had only to open its mouth for the roast pigeons of absolute knowledge to fly into it. That's of course a great quotation, end of quote now. So developing alternatives to capitalism seems to imply a paternalistic stance towards others, a superior standpoint from which the theorist glances down on the ignorant masses. The basic problem seems to be that constructing non-capitalist alternatives at the drawing board forecloses future possibilities. It seems to rob future people of the possibility to actually make their own history under self-chosen conditions. The democratic power of the members of a future society to determine for themselves how they want to organize society seems to be limited. As a consequence of this objection, Marx might have inferred that the best way to respect democratic autonomy was to keep one's allusions to a post-capitalist society as thin and indeterminate as possible. So elusiveness seemed to be best suited to avoid the anti-democratic danger of detailed blueprints. Okay, so on closer examination, however, I think it is not evident why outlining real utopias must necessarily limit democratic autonomy. To the extent that proposals for social alternatives mark their status as proposals, real utopias need not necessarily be undemocratic at all. That is, if they make clear that they do not aim to offer an ultimate solution that only has to be introduced and enforced from above. Real utopias are institutional proposals that take up experiences and ideas from social movements and practical experiments in order to further develop these ideas and experiments, and finally pass back these ideas into public discourses as part of an ongoing learning process. So when real utopias are developed and brought into the public sphere in this way, it is hard to see why they should be necessarily undemocratic or inhibit collective autonomy. Institutional proposals do not involve brainwashing anyone, as David Leopold recently put it in his critique of Marx's utopophobia. So no one is manipulated into accepting proposals in a way that denies their claim to self-determination. When institutional designs are put forward as proposals, they can be rejected, but they can also find rational endorsement. In that case, institutional proposals do not restrict democratic autonomy, they expand it. Then they resemble, as Leopold points out, travel guides from which travelers can let themselves be inspired without being predetermined by them. They facilitate the journey into unknown territory, but they do not prevent travelers from making different choices along the way. Okay, so one can push the argument even further. Critical theorists have no reason to shy away from envisioning the utopias, which I just pointed out. They even have a particular obligation to do so. as theorists, we do have a special knowledge to offer that we ought to share in public discourses. It would be complacent if critical theorists did not at least partly use their privileges of time and knowledge for developing real utopias. Why should this task be shifted entirely on lay people who are exposed to much more pressing constraints of everyday life? Their lives are severely constrained by the restrictive imperatives of making a living under conditions of capitalist domination, with their time resources severely constrained. So why should we burden them, of all people, with the responsibility of creating new visions of working together? We as critical theorists do have the resources in terms of time and money to escape the necessity of capitalist work life, at least to some extent. So we should use these resources to offer proposals how everyone can escape these constraints. So finally, it should be pointed out that the anti-democratic danger of utopias likely pertains more to utopian indeterminacy than to detailed models. So the claim is, my final claim is that utopian indeterminacy itself is intrinsically prone to turn into sectarian dogmatism. The reason is that once one assumes that a post-capitalist society is feasible, at least some people will want to know about the details of what such a society looks like. It would be presumptuous and arrogant if we, as critical theorists, refuse to respond to these questions and doubts. We would give the impression that we believe ourselves to be in an exclusive possession of a true knowledge, a knowledge that is inaccessible to everyone else. Therefore, refusing the debate and taking refuge in uncompromising vagueness invites undemocratic dogmatism. For this reason, I think the commitment to the possibility of an alternative to capitalism must remain accessible to critical scrutiny, and this requires being explicit about the details of one's ideas of alternatives to capitalism. Okay, so in conclusion, I argue or I conclude that there is no way around casting a picture of real utopias, something that Adorno disparagingly called auspinseln, casting a picture. Certainly, this cannot mean specifying every aspect of daily life as the classical utopian thinkers did. They devised strict rules for even the smallest details of everyday life, for example, in terms of a dress code and bedtimes and so on and so forth. But the construction of real utopias must address the institutional challenges that we face, and it must address these challenges with a minimum of detail to allow for critical scrutiny. Okay, thank you.
Well, we thank Professor Hannes Kuch. I'm sorry that I missed the sentences a couple times.
No.
But okay, now I will proceed to give the word to Alessandro Shiro, who will be our commentator today. Le agradecemos al profesor Hannes Kuch por su ponencia y ahora le voy a ceder la palabra a Alessandro Shiro, quien es la persona encargada de los comentarios en este panel.
Gracias, Valeria, por cederme la palabra. Thank you, both Professor Melo and Professor Kuch, for the very interesting presentations. Now I will have 10 minutes to deliver some comments, and I actually have both, well, only small comments, but mostly questions. So, first I would like to start highlighting that even though it might seem that we have like very different presentations in this table, I would like to highlight that there was a meeting point, perhaps a general one, but I think very relevant for a Congress that has critical theory as its main topic. And it is that critical theory is indeed an approach that provides us better tools to analyze present social issues in what Professor Melo was presenting, for example, the crisis of democracy and the public sphere, and in case of Professor Kuch's presentation, the alternative to capitalism, both very pressing issues nowadays. So after that, I would like to start with Professor Melo's presentation to highlight some points that I found particularly interesting. It's with first of all, this general thesis that I agree with, the fact that a proper analysis of the crisis of democracy should go beyond political regimes and institutions, because it's not a matter of having elections or not having elections, but rather, as Professor Melo mentions in his presentation, it's a matter of a form of life that encompasses different ways in which we relate to other people and we relate to the state and to the institutions in which we participate. So in that sense, another important point of the presentation was the public sphere as a key category for understanding democracy as a form of life, given that it's a very important social institution in which political democratic culture is constituted. Then a very interesting take as well was to analyze the crisis of democracy as a crisis of legitimation of hegemonic public spheres, product of the counter-public contestation dynamics. I think this was very interesting, but I will briefly present some questions about that in order to clarify a little bit more the concepts. And finally, a very interesting thing as well was the application of this theoretical framework, like informed by critical theory, and also those theories about public sphere to the Brazilian context, because I think that that's something that critical theory provides us, that not every branch of political theory provides us, and is that how close critical theory works with social sciences. Like we aim for analyses that are empirical informed, and I think this was a very good example of how critical theory can really make us help us make sense of like issues that we can observe and we are dealing with daily. So now I will go through the questions for Professor Melo. The first one is the clarification that I was mentioning about the dynamics of contestation or conflict between the hegemonic public sphere and the counter-publics. I'll proceed to read it. An important thesis of your presentation is that the crisis of democracy can be understood as a crisis of legitimation of the hegemonic public sphere as a consequence of the conflict dynamics of counter-publics. However, I was wondering if you could give us a more detailed explanation about the reason why the crisis of legitimation means a crisis of democracy. Is this limited to the Brazilian case, given that the conflict between progressive counterpublics and conservative counterpublics is becoming more violent, or is it because of the particular demands and narrative that the conservative counterpublics in Brazil defend and advance? So formulated in a different way, does the understanding of the crisis of legitimation as a crisis of democracy have to do with the quality of the dynamic of conflict? Does it have to do with the characteristics of the hegemonic public sphere that is losing its legitimacy? Or does it have to do with both? I think it would be very interesting to hear a more detailed explanation about this. A second question would be about the interaction between hegemonic public and the counter-publics. So in relation to the former question, I wanted to ask if that is the only way in which the hegemonic and non-hegemonic publics interact. Is it always a dispute for hegemony, or can there also be cases in which, for example, an issue politicized in a counter-public gets appropriated and discussed in the hegemonic public sphere and vice versa? Maybe something more similar to have the Habermasian way of understanding it, if that's also a possibility. Then a third question would be different forms of public dispute and opposition. You have mentioned that we can see the right's new ways of public dispute and opposition, for example, in Bolsonarism, which is certainly aggressive. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more regarding the genesis of those more violent narratives and disputes. Is it explained by the feeling of having lost hegemony, in this case to the left? Would you say that phenomena such as echo chambers, fake news, and conspiracy theories contribute to the exacerbation of those violent contestation dynamics as well? Because you mentioned that the internet has, in a way, contributed to new dynamics within the counterpublics, perhaps the constitution of new ones, because the possibility of exchanging information. So I was wondering if we can also have like this more critical analysis of like negative effects of what internet has brought as well. And finally, the question about the role of the critical theorists. So this is, well, this question will be in relation to a question to Professor Kuch as well. So you conclude your presentation rightly encouraging critical theories to diagnose contemporary political conflicts. However, I was wondering if you consider as well that critical theories tasks go beyond those diagnoses, and if we should not only diagnose public spheres, but also extend our task to the participation in the public sphere, and if that would constitute maybe a counterpublic or not. So now I proceed to Professor Kuch's presentation, which was also very interesting. Some of the points that I would like to highlight is, of course, the limitations of a purely negativistic approach related to the generalized pessimism regarding the possibility of overcoming capitalism and a lack of serious proposals, which are both feasible and desirable. Also, this discussion or this defense of elaborating real utopias against the claim that they might be undemocratic. I think here, I really like this point, and also because it can be, I guess, discussed in relation to topics that have been debated in other presentations in the same event, like, for example, the proposal of an open democracy. And finally, the idea of critical theorists as public philosophers. These are not the terms in which Professor Kuch presents it, but I think might be the similar idea of critical theorists have the duty to engage in public debates and contribute to formulating and analyzing alternatives to capitalism. So now I will go to the questions, and here's why I will read them. First, I think I would ask a clarification about your position on negativism. This is a good question, just for clarification. In the beginning of your presentation, it gives the impression that you deem determinate negation as an inadequate method to approach the critique of capitalism. However, at least in the current situation. However, as the argument gets further developed, you rather seem to suggest that it is not inadequate, but insufficient. Would it be correct then to say that what you propose is that a negativist approach should be rather considered as a first guiding step that then should lead us to the elaboration of more concrete proposals? Okay, the second question is regarding ideology. A point that you highlight several times is that in order for the critique of capitalism to be able to actually achieve a social transformation, such transformation should be thought of as possible. Then you also claim that the reason why determinate negation has lost power is because after 1989, there is a generalized feeling that all alternatives to capitalism are mere utopias. Maybe this will be clearer after the answer to the previous question, but this problem does not seem to be one of the negative method, but rather of the need of a critique of ideology, like a prior critique of ideology. This is not explicitly addressed in your presentation, but I believe that it is an underlying topic. So wouldn't that be an important part of being able to understand alternatives to capitalism as something that's possible? And in relation to this previous question, a third question, I was thinking of the ways in which economics is usually taught. It's usually taught and discussed in universities. Hopefully, things are changing now, but we could say that the hegemonic approach to economics has been the neoliberal one, which has led many people, in which we can include academics, politicians, and their advisors. I think this was very much perceivable in Peru's last elections. So this has led many people to think that any deviation from the neoliberal approach to economics is wrong economics. In that sense, wouldn't the critique of ideology, again, wouldn't it be even important to enable the proposal of real utopias, not only for thinking about them as possible, but even enabling the people to think about those things and to elaborate proposals? And finally, again, something related to the participation of critical theorists in the public sphere. So I think that you made clear that elaborating more concrete proposals needs not to be undemocratic, given that they can be done in such a way that incorporates the demands of social movements, for example. However, you also emphasize the role of critical theories in the elaboration of proposals and the importance of being open to answer questions about them. Therefore, I wanted to ask you about the relationship between critical theorists and social movements. How are we to avoid taking the position of the enlightened academic while also contributing to a bottom-up elaboration of alternatives to capitalism? Thank you.
Well, Alessandra, I really would like to thank you very much for all the questions. I'm not sure, really, if I can answer all of them, I mean, properly. I mean, but I'm going to try. Just one quick comment. Well, I totally agree with you that in critical theory must use some concepts in order to also not just to find a point of a critical concept with normative force. I mean, for example, the concept of public sphere. You know, if I say, okay, I'm using the concept of public sphere and also the concept of counter publics to highlight the actions, the ambitions of progressive social movements, you know, I can understand, and that's easy. And actually, we're used to study things like that because we're trying to understand the progressive social movements, feminism, anti-racist movements. You know, the problem was when when we try to use this kind of category to study things like, for example, right-wing movements. And they say, okay, public sphere and counter publicity, well, it happens it lost its normative and critical force. I'm not sure about that, you know, because we have to, I'm interested in this kind of concept, not just because, you know, we have an idea of a concept that presupposes general participation, inclusion, the possibility of argumentation, everybody, some universal aspects for and constraints for participation. No, one of the most important tasks for critical theorists is to produce this diagnosis. Of course, you know, the normative perspective will be generated inside this context, and maybe we won't find just one point of view, one and only normative point of view. I'm not defending that from the public sphere we'll find just one and only true and correct point for the critique. We have many points in dispute. So that's why I am defending this more heuristic concept of public sphere, you know, where the problems they eclode. That's important. So, and then I started saying that I agree with your first comment. So, well, I will try to answer the questions, maybe because they are more or less related. And in my opinion, the crisis of democracy is totally connected with the crisis of political legitimation. And this political legitimation is constructed and disputed and is part of the public sphere. The legitimation and the legitimacy is, in my view, is social. It's social. I'm not talking about legality. I'm talking about legitimacy. Who says that this is legitimate or not? We say, but we are not going to say the same thing. That's why we will conflict around legitimacy. But maybe all the dimensions of counter publicity, I think that they are related. But maybe I must clarify some points of my argument. I could give an example. If we start from in the case of Brazil, think about what happened since the redemocratization, for example. the dictatorship pursued and also criminalized plural social movements. That's what happened, and not just those, as I said, linked to class issues. So this idea of bourgeois autocracy that I mentioned in my text also involves other things, involves sexism, involves racism and homophobia, among other things. The redemocratization, that's the interesting point. That's why the things are connected. You know, what is hegemonic, what is counter-hegemonic, because counter-publicity is a relational category. So the redemocratization had, as I saw, the prominence of social movements that had precisely these themes. No, these movements, finally, they had a space to act in the official public sphere with those themes: sex, race, and sexuality. So for at least 20 years, maybe 20 years or more, all the subaltern publics, they became part of the official debates of the public sphere. So they had a more public legitimacy to discuss these themes, I guess. In some cases, the movements, they get institutional achievements in some cases. So they are passing from the margin to the center. You know, that happens after the dictatorship. It happens during the redemocratization. So I think that it's not contingent that Bolsonarism and other right-wing groups, they were publicly formed against these groups and against these themes. No, Bolsonarism, the case of Bolsonarism, was always against all political and public manifestations that resulted from the political culture that results from the redemocratization. You know, the political culture that was formed after redemocratization. It seems a little bit paradoxical, but maybe it is. You know, it's related, because if we see what happened with precisely these progressive counter-publics, you know, I mentioned the crisis of Lulism, and I mentioned the crisis of social developmentalism. They were important periods in Brazilian context because they were periods of social achievements. So they express something paradoxical, I guess, and because something paradoxical for the social movements, because I guess that part of social movements, in fact, they had important roles within the state and also in the formation of the official public opinion after, during the redemocratization. On the other hand, I think that the institutionalized movements, they were not enough. That was the problem. They were not enough. Other counterpublics, counterpublics formed outside the institutions of civil society and outside the state, they continued to criticize all the social reforms, all the social achievements, because for them there will be many problems to be faced yet. It was not solved yet. That is why progressive counterpublics, they radicalized certain things. So part of the first social movements, they were within the state, but part of these movements, they were outside the state. They were, to say with Nancy Fraser, they were weak publics, you know, they were outside, they were at the periphery of the society. And they brought these themes, mainly anti-racist struggles, feminism, etc., sexuality. So that's why there is a connection, as you asked, there's a connection between what we understand as hegemonic in some moment and what we see as something that is produced by the counterpublics. They are constituted as strong publics, not as weak publics, not strong publics. But in the case of right-wing groups, they have a lot in common, but they were also constituted by this crisis of the hegemony of the dominant public sphere after dictatorship. Because Camila Rocha, I mentioned Camila Rocha in my text. She published a book called Less Marx, More Mises. And she showed how right-wing counterpublics were formed as a kind of organized reaction against a specific model of society. A society formed by the governments of PSDB, the Social Democratic Party, and also by PT, the Workers' Party. These right-wing groups, they saw themselves as excluded from this hegemonic mode of society. That was a crazy thing, but this society for themselves was based on a kind of a left hegemonic project. So these groups who perceived themselves as excluded, they were formed through social networks. They formed explicitly counter publics that defended the minimum state, defended in the economy, defended conservative values in family and religion. They tried to create opposed agendas. They create opposition against progressive agendas in the public space. This is that's what we could say that is something similar. We have two different experiences. How they saw the crisis of this model. In their opinion, they were excluded from the hegemonic public sphere because for them, there was no longer space for them there. No longer space in the official public sphere for right-wing alternative ideas, no more space for conservative ideas, no more space for ultra-liberal ideas in economy, They were, there was all the distribution policy during that period, they were totally against that. They were against social pluralism. Therefore, they are totally against the achievements of our constitution, 1988 constitution. It's a democratic constitution. What's interesting is that why is similar? Because they did something very similar if we compare with what the movements have done after dictatorship. They did the same thing. They say that they had no space where? In newspapers. They had no space where? In television, they say. We have no space in radio. We have no space in the official public sphere. That's why they started to form alternative opinions on the internet, above all. They explicitly decided to create counterpublics. They decided to create their own media, their own publishers, their own newspapers. They are very organized. Their own radio. But as I mean, it's essential. They use they found for the internet before the left-wing groups. This is amazing. And they use a lot of violent and direct actions. Counter publicity is defined by this kind of something